r/NoSleep. Posted by you/outside your window _. When I found her, she was waving at her reflection. It wasn't waving back. The kids were circled up around me, bumping shoulders and elbows in excitement. We were standing on the bank of the Delaware River in the late part of the summer. The sky was bright and free of clouds. It was a perfect day to float. "Partner up," I yelled. When I gave the order, the kids ran to their predetermined partners, something they figured out over the Camp Pine lunch tables. Within a moment, the circle became a dozen pairings. All except for one girl. Zoe joined camp the morning of the canoe trip. "I'm new," she said, shaking my hand in the parking lot. I looked around for her mom or dad, but they had already driven off. It wasn't strange for kids to join halfway through camp, but we were already in the last week. And as hard as it would be for anyone to make friends in that situation, she wasn't exactly approachable. Her hair was greasy, almost wet looking, and combed straight over her eyes, making her head look like a big, black mop. She didn't talk to anyone on the van, or in the circle. When everyone found their partners and Zoe was left standing alone, I reacted quickly. I knew what it was like to be picked last, or not picked at all. I walked over to her and spoke softly, so the other kids wouldn't notice. "Zoe, you can take a kayak," I said, "you don't need a partner for that." Zoe nodded, looking neither happy nor sad. Her mouth was a perfect line. As Jack, the other canoe instructor, got the kids in their boats, I walked over to Charles to confirm the pickup time. Charles was the oldest person to work at Camp Pine. His stomach slouched over his belt and his mouth was filled with gray teeth. His job was to drive the canoe van, then wait for us at the end of the trip. Even though he was as old as my parents, he liked to gossip about the kids. He'd tell me about what he heard on the route over, or how kids needed to get beat so they'd stop cursing so much. When I walked over to him though, he had a strange look of excitement on his face. His arms were crossed over his chest. "Keep a lookout today," he said. "A lookout?" I asked. He flashed a plaque-filled smile as he leaned in closer to me. "So, my brother's an EMT and texted me that a 12-year-old girl drowned about 20 minutes north of here last night. Apparently her mom found a handwritten note on the boating dock and, what looked like, muddy footsteps leading right into the water. The mom said her daughter was one of those depressives, so probably dark clothes and makeup and all that, if the water didn't strip her of that by now. Look out for the body. Any dead body is probably her." Charles paused to wipe the spit from his mouth. He hadn't taken a breath that whole time. "She was probably lonely too," he went on. "If she wanted to do something as dumb as off herself, she probably didn't have any friends. You can never predict what loneliness does to a person." I nodded. I knew what he meant. Even though I'd worked at Camp Pine for 3 years, I didn't really talk to the other counselors. I would eat lunch in my car as I watched them gossip and laugh and wrap their arms around each other at the tables. Charles' gossip was the only kind I was included in. But, for as much as Charles liked gossip, his rumors never involved dead girls floating in the river. I turned back to look at the water. The trees were swaying softly, the Delaware was bluer than usual. In the distance, I could see a group of tubers drifting in a big, yellow clump. They were singing a song I didn't recognize. It seemed strange that a dead girl would be somewhere below all of that. "Yeah, I'll keep an eye out," I said. Charles reached out and shook my hand, as if we had just entered a binding agreement. I was on dead girl watch. As he drove away and the campers stumbled onto their boats, I asked Jack to lead the group today. I had to look for the body, plus I knew new girl Zoe would be slower than the rest. Jack wouldn't keep an eye on her. Jack was more personality than leader. There'd been more than a few occasions when campers had jumped out of their boats and into the river while Jack was busy telling a few kids about the time he saw a shark at the Jersey Shore. But, today, I couldn't worry about that. I had to focus on both Zoe and the dead girl. While Jack guided the rest of the kids down the route, I helped Zoe get into her kayak. New kids always took longer to get ready, but Zoe handled each step like the boat would swallow her whole. In another situation, I probably would have just tossed Zoe in the boat and let her figure it out, but she was in a fancy-looking black dress with no shoes on. Normally, we didn't even let kids go on the water without the right equipment, but this was how Zoe showed up. By the time she sat in the boat, the rest of the campers were already dots on the horizon. "You ever do this before?" I asked. We were both in the water now, the current pushing us forward. Zoe shrugged. "Done what?" she asked. "Float," I said. "Tube? Kayak? Canoe? Anything like that?" Zoe looked up to the clouds. She stared like that for a long time, as if her thoughts were getting dislodged. "No, I don't think so," she said. "Just do your best and ask questions," I said. As we dropped into the current and started to close the gap with the other campers, I focused my attention back on the water. I'd never seen a dead body before, so I wasn't exactly sure what to look for. Would it look like the dead girl was swimming? Would she look like a log? Or, maybe, she wouldn't even be floating. Maybe she was clinging to the bottom, with the branches and stones and spare tires. Out ahead, I saw Jack wave the kids over to the first big eddy, where we reviewed technique before the second stretch. As the campers paddled to the side of the river, I turned to wave Zoe over. But, when I did, she wasn't behind me. Panic dropped into the pit of my stomach, but it didn't last long. I turned to the right bank, and there she was. She was floating near a tree, looking down into the water. I could see her mouth moving. As I paddled upstream over to her, she turned to me with a confused look on her face. It was the first real expression I'd seen from her the whole trip. "My reflection isn't changing," she said. She looked back into the water and waved, as if to prove her point. In the distance, I could hear Jack go over the sea stroke. He was doing a horrible job. "Zoe, there's no time for this," I said, "you're missing the training. Let's." But, before I could finish, I looked down at Zoe's reflection. As she leaned over the side of her kayak and waved, her reflection stayed still. The face in the water didn't change, it looked back at her with eyes as round as quarters and a mouth filled with mud. In the soft waves, the reflection froze in a bloated look of horror. "Look," Zoe said. She put her fingers into the sides of her mouth, stuck out her tongue, and waved it around. "My reflection isn't changing. It's like a magic mirror." I tried to say something but I couldn't speak, like my mouth was filled with the same mud. I grabbed the rope attached to the end of Zoe's kayak and pulled her toward me. Jack's voice was echoing across the water. He asked what I was doing. I didn't respond. I felt a sour feeling in my stomach. Adrenaline hit like a punch in the gut. We needed to go. Now. I pulled harder on Zoe's kayak, but she kept leaning toward the reflection, paddling herself closer. "What are you doing?" she said. "I need to stay. Please. It's magic." She was beginning to hyperventilate. As she sucked for air, her eyelids retracted back into her head. "Let me stay," she begged. "Let me stay." She looked as scared as the reflection. "Zoe," I said, "you need to calm." She turned to me, her face twisted in horror. It looked like she just remembered a nightmare. "Was last night real?" "I thought I was." "It can't be," she said. "I was just scared, and sad, and feeling alone. I didn't mean to jump in." As we locked eyes, I could understand something I didn't want to understand. I felt her fear, and confusion, and desperation. We needed to get back to the campers. We shouldn't be hanging out near this reflection. As I used my body weight to yank the kayak closer, I looked back at the other campers. They were turned toward us now, laughing. Even Jack was laughing. I felt shame, and fear, and embarrassment. Here I was again, the last one left behind, the butt of the joke. I had one job. All I had to do was get Zoe to the end of the river. It was the last week of camp, and I couldn't even do that? It's not like I did this job for the friends. I pulled again on Zoe's kayak, but this time it came to me too easily. When I looked back, the water was calm. The breeze was soft and warm. I looked down at my hand, and the rope I was holding led to the front of my own canoe. All I could hear was the laughter of the other campers. "Canoe man Dan's finally had enough of us," Jack yelled to me. "He's talking to himself behind a tree." I looked at the empty water. "Zoe?" I said. But, all of a sudden, her name sounded embarrassing, like a high schooler mentioning Santa Claus. As easy as it was to believe she was there, it was just as easy to believe she never was. I looked closer at the still water, and that's when I saw it. The reflection was still there. Her fingers were crooked and cold-looking, held out grabbing for air. Her black hair swarmed like Medusa's snakes. It was tangled up in seaweed, pulling her closer to the bottom. I rode a little closer and looked down at the drowned girl's eyes. They were staring aimlessly up into the trees, the pupils falling in different directions. Her mouth looked the most strange, like a torn blanket. As I sat in the still water over her, I grabbed my radio and called Charles. I don't remember what I said. My thoughts were wind through a treeless field. Within 10 minutes, there were bright lights and police cars and scuba divers. We got the kids out of the water and then, next I remember, I was standing in my house. My parents wrapped me in a hug, but I pushed away from them. It was awkward, and cold. Behind them, Zoe's picture was on the news. That night, I sat up in my bed and looked out the window. I got a few texts from other counselors. They were all new numbers, showing up as meaningless codes in my phone. I didn't respond. Instead, I just looked at my reflection in the glass. My face was warped, and distant, and familiar. I stuck my fingers in my mouth and stuck out my tongue. My reflection replied, so I crawled into bed and went to sleep.